U.S. officials say today will be the most intense day of strikes against Iran. The U.S. Secretary of War went so far as to declare the U.S. as winning the war. And Iran, he says, is getting weaker and more isolated.
Iran's neighbors, and in some cases, former allies in the Gulf, they've abandoned them. And their proxies, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Hamas, either broken, ineffective, or on the sidelines. Iran stands alone, and they are badly losing.
Pete Hegseth's comments follow statements from Donald Trump last night. The U.S. president says his country's military commanders are very close to ultimate victory. But how likely is that ultimate victory? For that, we've reached former UK ambassador to the UN, John Sowers. He's also the former chief of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and he's currently an executive chairman of Newbridge Advisory, a geopolitical consulting firm. Thank you so much for joining us today and making time for us.
Pleasure, Alfie. Nice to talk to you.
So we were just listening in to the U.S. Secretary of War, and Pete Hegseth has said that the United States will not relent in its war with Iran until, quote, the enemy is totally and decisively defeated. So given now that there are multiple players involved in this conflict, does the U.S. decide when the war ends?
Well, I think President Trump made it pretty clear last night that he is minded to bring this war to an end sooner rather than later. Iran has been militarily devastated by this conflict. It's lost its missile capacity. It's lost its ability to produce many types of weapons. So it is definitely close to a sort of military defeat. But the regime itself is intact and in some ways has been radicalized by this experience even further. So it depends what you set as your goal here. And the United States has been very unclear throughout this conflict what it's actually trying to achieve. It does look to me as though we're going to end at some point in the next week or so with many of the specific targets struck and destroyed, but with the regime still intact.
So when we're talking about the potential for a military defeat in Iran, but it's unclear, as you mentioned there, whether or not that was the true objective for the U.S. and Israel as they head into these initial strikes and this war against Iran. So I'm wondering, in terms of the objectives here, is there a justification for the conflict as it began? And what is the intended outcome?
Well, you'd have to ask an American administration spokesman that question about what the intended outcome is. My own view is that this war is unnecessary. I don't think it was required by any threat against the United States. Indeed, after the strikes last summer, the area of the issue of greatest concern, Iran's nuclear program, was pretty badly damaged. Whether it was obliterated or not is a matter of debate, but certainly it was not posing any sort of threat to the United States. You talk about US and Israel objectives. I think actually their goals are slightly different. The United States wants to do as much damage as it can to Iran's military capacity, but I think it still wants to have a group of people in Tehran that it can hold to account. I think Israel's approach is rather different, perhaps understandable given their terrible experience 2.5 years ago with the assault by Hamas against its citizens. And in many ways, the aftermath of that has led to all the events that we're witnessing today. But I think Israel doesn't really care what the outcome in Iran itself is. It just wants to do as much damage and to destroy as much as it can of the fabric of the Iranian regime. And is even talking about sponsoring a civil war inside the country by arming and encouraging the Kurds to launch an insurgency. So there's a difference of view here between the United States and Israel. Ultimately, Donald Trump will decide when the US assault comes to an end, but it's quite possible in my mind that the Israelis will carry on even after the Americans have finished.
You know, Mr. Sowers, you did mention something in our first response, and that was to the end of the regime within Iran. We know that there has been a leader that has been newly appointed, that is the son of the former supreme leader, who, of course, was killed in the first weekend of the strikes that were launched by the U.S. and Israel. In terms of this being a point for coming together, for reinvigorating the regime, how much of a defeat or a failure is that for the U.S. as it began this war? And we've even heard the U.S. president say the worst scenario is that it's the same regime that it was when we started.
Well, that may well be what the Americans end up with. There have been words of defiance from Ali Larijani, a senior figure in the regime, where we may not see much of the new supreme leader because the Israelis have vowed to kill him. And given the record of the Mossad in tracking down people they want to assassinate, he is going to stay well out of sight for a good while to come. So I think the American interest is to have a group of people in Tehran they can deal with. Obviously, any successor regime to that of the departed supreme leader is going to have to address the predicament that Iran is in now. Its whole strategy has failed. Its economy is in ruins. Its ability to project power is close to zero, and it cannot even defend itself. So the whole strategy of the last 40 years has ended in failure. Now, the very worst outcome, I think, for the region and indeed for Europe would be civil war in Iran, because that would lead to a massive outflowing of refugees and a center of instability, probably a growth of terrorism again. So it's important that there is a regime there. What we want is a sort of what the Americans have dubbed a Venezuela option, where you have a regime which is willing to do a deal with the United States and with the region to be more cooperative and to be less disruptive, less exporting of its revolutionary ideology. But that looks a bit of a stretch at now. But it may be that after a while, after they've reflected on the position that they're in after this conflict, the Iranians will do that. Equally, there's a risk that they will remain as radicalized as they sound at the moment and be set on revenge. The new supreme leader lost his father, lost his mother, lost his wife, and lost his son. I don't think he's going to be in a very forgiving mode.
You know, finally, Mr. Sowers, in the last 30 seconds that I do have with you, I wanted to ask you about the potential here for this to be a protracted, prolonged conflict and to be expansive. We know that the British warship has departed the UK on its way to the Eastern Mediterranean. We know also that there have been talks from the Secretary of War that they don't want to see this prolonged, but history sometimes shows differently. What do you believe is the potential exit strategy here?
Well, certainly after the first Gulf War in 1991, we spent the following 12 years having to contain the challenges posed by the Saddam regime. Now, Iran is different from Iraq, but it could well be a decade or more that we have a continued problem of managing the threat from Iran, especially if it descends into internal chaos. So I think the best way out of this is for President Trump to declare an end, declare victory in his terms as soon as possible, to bring the Israelis under control, which the Americans can do, and allow a weakened regime to establish itself, which everyone can deal with. But that may be wishful thinking. It may be that we are set for a period of extended violence generated by a collapsing and angry and aggrieved regime in Tehran, and that spells bad news for the immediate neighbors in the Persian Gulf and other countries surrounding Iran.
Mr. Sowers, I want to thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Pleasure, Arthur.
That is former Chief of the British Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, John Sowers. Thanks again.